Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Alan.
Oh, that's right. We got Alan. Alan, I was going to introduce you. I was going to give you a really fancy introduction because not everyone knows who you are and why you are here on our special episode. So for those of you listening, this is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week, we talk about a given topic in the field of behavior analysis. We go into some research topics. However, we're doing things a little different this episode because it's the first of two parts related to three parts. It's the first of Supervision September. It's a multi-part series we'll be doing. I think it's our fifth Supervision September. So
make the sound.
What's the sound? Yeah, it's Supervision September. Woo! Here we are. It's our fifth one. If you love supervision and you're like, man, I can't wait to learn about supervision, maybe 3 hours worth so I can get those 3 supervision CEs, guess what? Listen to every episode this September. And not only are you going to get those, but also a bonus kind of ethics-y supervision that we're calling an ethics episode. So we got it all. You got some ethics, a lot of supervision.
But
everything's coming up.
This one's only supervision.
This one's only supervision. So because we decided we wanted to do a book club supervision podcast, which we've done a few of these before, we brought in our ringer, our book club ringer, and he already introduced himself, Alan Haberman. Alan, it is so great to have you here on a main feed episode. You've been on some of our Patreon locked episode book clubs, but we're so glad to have you here to discuss our book today. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I've enjoyed the Patreon book club episodes and I love the podcast. And so to be able to come and do the book club is great.
So this is Alan's, this is your fourth official book club, Alan. Not everyone, some people have probably heard you in our previews for the Patreon episodes. And those are still locked. They'll be unlocked as this year goes on. We'll be making some new ones, but we're very excited to have everyone get to listen to everything you have to say about this book because you have thoughts on the book we'll be doing. I believe.
What an understatement, Rob. What an understatement.
So because it's Supervision September and because we've done some other supervision books, we really thought it was time to go back in the very way back machine and do a formal discussion of 1937's How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I almost said Dr. Dale Carnegie, but he's not a doctor. Not a doctor, folks. Just a regular old Joe.
Boy from Missouri.
Writing a book.
It's 1936, though, Rob.
Sorry, 1936. Are you sure?
Yes, I'm looking at the copyright page right now.
Okay, 36. Sorry.
36 with a renewed copyright in 1964 and a revised edition copyright in 1981.
Okay, so 19. Well, there's something about we'll get to copyright issues. Yeah, so this is the 1981 edition of a 1936 book. You said 6, right, Jackie? Now I'm confused.
36. Yep.
36. Okay, no, yes, you're totally right. Apologies, everyone. 1936. I was off a year on this nearly 100-year-old book. So sorry.
Wow.
And this is going to be a 2-part episode because usually for our book clubs, when we've done them in the past, we do them as 2 parts. When we do them on the Patreon, we go 2 hours in length. So we figured it's not fair to give any book short shrift. We give 2 full episodes. So this is our 2 supervision episodes of 3 total ones. These are just going to be on how to win friends and influence people. So a lot of people out there have probably either read this book, had someone tell them they should read this book, or at the very least heard about this book, because it is not exactly a behavior analytic book, mostly because a lot of the thoughts in here are sort of contemporary with many of, Skinner's initial work. So it'd be impossible to be a behavior analytic book because ABA did not exist at the time this book was written. The behavior analysis was in its infancy.
Experimental analysis of behavior did.
Yes.
So experimental analysis of behavior was established around the early 1930s.
Around the time this book was written as well.
Yeah, but ABA was, solidified 1968 when they had the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was published.
Yes. Well, this is an old book. And let's start. We usually do this by kind of sharing everyone's thoughts on how did they come to this book and sort of their general feel of the book and sort of what they hope to accomplish in these episodes in discussing how to win friends and influence people. Who would like to start us off?
Me.
Jackie, go.
So hilariously, I was looking through some old pictures in my big box of pictures. And
one of you and Dale just hanging out?
Me and Dale. Yeah, because he's my dad. Just kidding. Wouldn't that be funny? No, but I was looking at pictures of like me as a child the other day and trying to like organize my life. And I picked up a picture where it was me sitting on my dad's chair and this book was sitting next to it. So my dad was in business. And so it was probably like 87 maybe. And so I was like, huh, that looks interesting. I like zoom in. Yep.
Wow.
So I guess I, through osmosis, read this book in 1987 while I was watching Fraggle Rock.
So you were born to do this podcast, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I was born to this podcast. As far as whether I liked the book, not exactly. I didn't
don't get
love it.
too negative right off the bat because we want people to listen to the next episodes.
Yeah, I found it a little boring. I'm not going to lie. Also because I read it before bed. I like, so that may also be right. It has to be like someone's going to get murdered or I'm not going to be able to attend to the book. The principles are okay. They're okay, right? But for a supervision book, I think we can glean some golden nuggets out of the book. So I'm excited to talk about what those are.
Okay. Alan, why don't you kind of share your thoughts and all?
Well, I have this restriction of not being too negative. I am not a huge fan of this book as a go-to for supervision, at least not immediately. I see it as best used for if someone has no sort of soft skills or really struggles with soft skills. It's a nice sort of layout of how to be personable, how to potentially deal with difficult people. I'm not a huge fan of it otherwise. 100 years old, as you said, it's written by a white businessman with some religious and political beliefs that complicate the message if you sort of know about it. My favorite factoid is that Sinclair Lewis hated it so much, he wrote a really, really strongly worded New Yorker review of this book. And it's a horrible, horrible piece. But that's how bad Sinclair Lewis disliked this. He was willing to publish an awful piece of writing
Wow.
undermining this book. The key pun is if you follow this book, instead of being a car nay guy, you'll be a car yes man. That's the best bit of information from that review that I can share. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan, and I agree with Sinclair Lewis that this book could be seen as a way to learn how to screw people over to your advantage.
That is what, when I talk to someone, I'm like, oh, I'm reading this book. And the person that I was speaking to was like, oh, how to be slimy. And I was like,
I don't. Okay, I feel like that's a little.
No. I think it's a little far too, right? And I was like, no, but I can see how some people might construe it that way, right? Because he does talk a lot about manipulation. So, we'll get there.
Well, I don't think our buddy Dale would call it manipulation, Jackie. I think he'd refer to it as a new way of living life. Is how he would refer to it. And also, just in case anyone's like, ooh, trigger warning in terms of political stuff, like, oh man, I don't want to talk about Republicans, Democrats. Political stuff in terms of, do you prefer, which Roosevelt is your favorite Roosevelt as president? So
that Teapot Dome scandal.
Yeah, well, Warren G. Harding. Yeah, ooh, Millard Fillmore. I don't know about that guy. Yeah, it's old politics. So we're not going to bring too many modern political conversations into this book. I don't think they were. Do you like Abraham Lincoln? I mean, probably everyone does at this point. I don't know if everyone did in 36, but Dan, how about you?
I came to this book by you telling me to read it for a book club. I'd never read it before, and I'd heard about it, and it's always one of those books you're like, oh, I guess I should probably read that because it keeps coming up in various conversations, but I had never read it before. And I am glad that I read it because I think that we're going to have a good discussion, and one that's informed not just by the book itself, but by where we are at our current place and time with respect to a lot of the underlying issues in this book. And I'm better able to, I think, consume and discuss that now than if I had read it a long time ago in grad school or something like that. So it's now going to be part of what I think about when I think about supervision.
Okay.
Yeah.
As for me, I'd heard about the book. I think like everyone has as a book. It was mentioned in the Supervisor's Guidebook when we did that book club 3-4 years ago, I guess at this point. And I said, you know what? I probably should read that because I'll be honest, I'm probably going to be the Pollyanna when it comes to discussing this book. I'm going to be, come on, everybody. Dale's just trying to help us out. Like I think some of these skills are so important. So I'm going to be the most positive. I am predicting of all of us on the show, though I will not be completely in the bag for our buddy Dale, because I think Alan brought up some good points when we first begged him, please come back for this book club. And he's like, oh, that was the one book I don't want to talk about. Brought up some very good points. So I did a little extra homework on the history of the book that I hope will make this a more fun conversation than me being like, I like this, and everyone else saying, no, we don't like this, Rob. So I do appreciate this book for, I think, where it stands in sort of history. And to some extent, while some of these principles, I think we can talk about as, well, you know what, these do feel in line with some of our empathetic listening, possibly even cultural competence in certain ways. I really think we probably want to come to this book kind of like you would come to something like Citizen Kane. Maybe not quite like that, but the idea of, you know what, so much of what's in this book is sort of a part of what we think about when we think about business in America. And one of the books that we'll be talking a little bit about was Americanon by McHugh, who wrote an entire book about what are the books that are like American books that have just been in the cultural awareness for so long that they not only speak to what it was like to be an American at whatever time they were written, but they sort of still capture the idea of, you know, what is it to be American in this day and age?
What else is in there?
Like
Grapes of Wrath?
Pilgrim's Progress.
I probably have read none of them.
No, but they weren't books you'd think. They were mostly like nonfiction-y books. So like Ben Franklin's writings, Betty Crocker's cookbook was in there. So they weren't. So, and this was one of them. One of the dictionaries. I can't remember which one. If it was
that one. I've read that dictionary.
So again, it wasn't like it wasn't really fiction books. So I think for many of you, you could certainly, if you've read this book before, I think this will hopefully be a nice way to sort of bring some of these ideas to the future, which ideas are still relevant, which ones are not. If you've never read this book before and you're sort of worried, should I read this super duper old book? I mean, it's up to you. But at the same time, you could probably like read a paper that Roger Ebert wrote about Citizen Kane and learn all you need to know about Citizen Kane. It's a super old movie, or you could go watch Citizen Kane. I think this one's the same. I'm kind of hopeful that this is a good enough discussion that people who don't like, I don't have time to read this book, or this book's so old, I don't think it's relevant. Well, I'll listen to these 2 episodes about the book and I'll get what I need to know so that I'm not quite at the primary source level, but I'm a little bit closer than if I just never read it at all and just assumed I knew what was in it. Because so much of what's in here, I think we take for granted as sort of how business works in America, because it is so old and was written at such a crucial moment in American history that it's still popular. It's still there. So whether or not this is the best supervision book, which I think we'll all agree, this is not the best supervision book you'll ever read, it's going to be a part of supervision for at least another generation, if not longer. It's just been in the public consciousness for so long. So there is a relevance to discussing it. Whether you're agreeing or not, there's definitely a relevance to discussing it. And I hope everyone listening agrees at the end of our 2 episodes with that statement.
And one thing I do want to throw Dale a bone. You know, when they wrote the preface to the 1981 edition, they were like, remember, this book, the 1981 edition, is different than the 1968 edition, which is different than the 1936 edition, because things are different and we are learning as a culture. And they say in the preface, which I love, if it's called a preface, I don't know if it's called a preface. I love that, obviously, if it was going to be written after, I think he died in 2002 or whatever, according to the preface.
Dale Carnegie?
Yeah.
He died in the 50s. I think he died in 55.
Well,
his wife, and we should do
he wrote it. Yep.
Quick shout out to his wife.
Well, and I also want to throw him a bone because I will be the most vocal or how do I want to say that? I will be against this book probably the most vocally, or at least sort of my input led to sort of a pro and con approach to this, which I'm very appreciative of being able to engage in that conversation. It's still included in Bailey and Birch's 25 essential skills, for further reading and informed, I think, some of what they have or what they discuss in that book. And I like that book. I feel it's a much more appropriate place to start for supervision. At least it's what's helped me the most. And knowing that if these were the kind of skills I needed to pursue, that how to win friends and influence people is still appropriate potentially because it is mentioned in a more professional piece on supervision in our field.
Sure, although that work is also not without potential concerns too.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that there are works that are not perfect at all times and context doesn't change over time? This is the first I've heard of this.
No, I'm not. And I think, part of our job here is going to be that we need to take what's in this book and pull from it the relevant pieces for supervision as we see it today and relate it back to the principles of behavior analysis. Because there's plenty of stuff in here that is going to relate back, right? And it's going to allow us to be able to talk about punishment or reinforcement and extinction, et cetera. So that's going to be our job. But are there updates that could happen since 1981? Probably. That was 40 years ago.
And 1981 was such a great year. I mean, we got it right, I think. But that was the year we did it, folks.
That was the year?
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I was pretty young in 1981.
So he's an 8-track tape player.
Cassettes were around in 1981.
I don't think I have a picture of me, Jackie, talking about childhood pictures on my green tweed couch wearing my Burr and Ernie slippers right next to the 8-track.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was 1982.
All right.
Now, I wasn't born yet. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Hey, Alan, get out of here.
Yeah. There are young people allowed in this old podcast. So before we get into, I think, the history and the context of the book, which we don't always do that for our book clubs, but I do think given the age of this book, if we don't talk about sort of when it was written, it loses a lot of why some of the components of this book would even be in there and why some of them are clearly out of date while some might not be as out of date. I do want to just quickly say kind of the goals in terms of this podcast related to supervision benchmarks. I kind of wrote down a couple in the notes, Jackie, and I sort of, if anyone feels there are some others, or Jackie, do you want to go over those? That's usually your forte is bam, here's the list of what's the most important for task list.
Yeah, so I added some as well.
Yes, please go ahead. I mean, I think some of these, I think I went overboard on a few of them. So you pick the ones that are the most relevant. Because some of these reading them, I think they're like kind of part of just general supervision, but not necessarily related to this book. So what are the ones we have?
So I thought for part one and the general overview of supervision, state the reasons for using behavior analytic supervision and the potential risk for ineffective supervision. We're going to be doing that a ton, right? So the book is outlined against 9 principles, and what we're going to do is basically dissect those principles, right? Look about how are these principles behavior analytic? How could we make them be behavior analytic? And if we use them as they stood, would that result in ineffective supervision, right? So that's kind of how I imagine my role in this is talking about that, right? And, one of the main, I think, premises of the book is you want your employees to perform well, right? And when you're talking about the risks of ineffective supervision, you might see poor client outcomes, poor supervisee performance, poor outcomes overall, right? So I think that's where that will tie in. Establishing clear performance expectations for the supervisor and supervisee, I2, I think will tie in to some of the principles as well. And then indirectly, but I think it's important that we talk about I3, select supervision goals based on an assessment of the supervisee's skills. And then obviously I7, where we talk about using function-based strategies to improve personnel performance, right? That I think we're going to need to glean from our own interpretation of the principles, because at that time, he wasn't talking about function-based strategies.
I will say, though, speaking of I7 and function-based strategy, I did find in my notes some of the principles. I said, this feels so much like what you might do when you're doing like an interview to determine the function of another person's behaviors, specifically related to soft skills, like what are the barriers to this individual doing what I want them to do, which again is not quite the same as when we talk about function-based treatment, because our goal is not, I need this person to do what I want so much as why is this person not able to do the things that they want? But some of those basic ideas I do feel are in this book.
How about that attention-based insanity? That's function. Did you miss that part of the book?
Which part of the book?
Where you talk about the women who went insane because they wanted attention.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That was function. Incorrect.
Function, right? Yeah. So then we'll talk about the ineffective risk of supervision, right?
Murray, again, I don't want to defend that statement. However, the idea of mental health being based on a principle, based on like access to attention or escape from aversives, like that was in like Murray Sidman's Coercion and its Fallout. Like he had a whole section on the idea of like, I don't remember if it was anxiety, but like some mental health issues being related to that. So it's not like Dale made that up. That was sort of a prevailing thought for many people and might still be for many people. Not me, Diana. You're looking at me. No.
I'm moving on. H1, state intervention goals in observable and measurable terms, right? I think that will get at multiple principles, right? And then collaborate with others who support or provide services to clients. That's going to be all of these, right? Like principle 4, principle 5.
That actually honestly might be, if you just read this book and were like, I got to put one supervision goal that I can just, without thinking about it, I can just take from this book and use in my daily practice. That actually might be the most direct correlate in terms of like, a lot of times you work with other people. A lot of what you're trying to do is get them to join you on using function-based treatments, using basic behavior analytic principles. So if there's one skill that you don't want to do any thinking about and just read the book and take it at face value, that's probably the one, I would say.
Yeah. And then I added H3, recommend intervention goals and strategies based on factors as client preferences, supporting environments, risk, constraints, and sociability, right? And I think that will most align when you're talking about like principles like 7 through 12, I think. Yeah.
Great.
If I could just interject, just sort of related to that, my perspective, especially personal perspective on this book, relates to the new ethics code of like 1.07, cultural like responsivity, and I think it's 1.10, awareness of personal biases and challenges. Because as someone who, I'm not on the autism spectrum, I have attention deficit disorder, but a lot of my criticism of this book comes from the fact that this book feels like masking. Like we're sort of teaching people how to mask and to function within one way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that as a field, we make sure that we teach that there are multiple ways to be successful with like social interactions and soft skills. And sort of, even conditional discrimination of like, you might not be successful with taking that approach elsewhere, but we want to make sure that when we're working with behavior analysts, that we don't just expect these types of behaviors, which you could construe recommending this book as like, this is the right way and the only way.
Good point. Good point, Alan.
I mean, to be honest, the title of the book is the only book you need to lead you to success. Right? Like in the title.
Part of selling your book is making it clear, like, I know you've got limited funds. If you're going to buy one book, this is the book you should buy. And I don't think we would say that about anything. Like, if you're only going to read one journal article this year, this is like, we never say that. There are so much context that you would gain from multiple sources. So no one's ever going to say this is the only, other than the title and the people trying to sell you the book, we're never going to say, this is it. This is the one. We found it. The holy grail of supervision books. I'm not going to say that. And I told you, I'm the soft touch. It was the biggest BFF of my buddy Dale here, I think. All right. So now that we've kind of done some nice introduction, I think some nice context of what we'll be talking about, we're going to do two things before we get into the book. One, like I said, I think we need to talk about the history of when this book was written and some of the milestones, because some people might still be saying this book is old, this book is out of date, it is not appropriate to discuss. And we kind of want to keep getting at why we think there is still value in having this discussion. Maybe not making people read this book as part of your coursework, but having a working knowledge of why it exists, why it might still be relevant in some ways and not relevant in a lot of other ways. And then also kind of discussing some of the broader topics related to why is this not the only book you need to lead you to success, i.e., just because you wrote a book in the 30s for straight white businessmen to follow, that doesn't mean it's the right book for everybody and every single problem. Again, in Dale's defense, it would be really hard to be like, Dale, how come you didn't use more, people from this group or more exemplars from this group? It actually, in some more discussions, there are more like female business people and more sort of like home skills in this version, the 1981 edition. And again, I think a lot of that's going to be really a testament to how hard his wife worked after the publishing of the book and after his passing to continue making it a relevant book. Because at the end of the day, this really does feel like your old uncle telling you some stories from when he used to sell globes door to door. There is that component of it. But anyway, let's get into some historical context. And a lot of this I took some of this from the introduction where Dale Carnegie himself talks about his life. Take that with a grain of salt. I also took this from, like I said, Jess McHugh's book, Americanon, An Unexpected U.S. History and 13 Best-Selling Books. There's a whole chapter on how to win friends and influence people where she does go into history. So I did kind of, cross-cite some of Dale's statements with her own research to sort of see what of these pieces is probably most accurate. So again, the book was written in 1936 and sold about 5,000 copies to start. Since then, it's gone on to be, as McHugh writes, part of the American canon of nonfiction books. It's still an all-time bestseller. I mean, it's still a bestseller to this day, even though it has been written in 1936. And outside of books that I think you're forced to read as part of, your high school American literature curriculum, there aren't that many books, I think, that are this old that people are still buying on a regular basis. I'm sure there are a bunch.
The Bible.
The Bible. Okay, the Bible's pretty old. How old is that? That's way more than 100 years old, right? So yes, there are other books that I think, not to make this, the paramount book or anything like that. But I'll try to note sort of, when I'm talking about what Dale talks about in the introduction, where Jess McHugh talks about Carnegie. So Dale Carnegie doesn't talk too much about his early life, but I think McHugh's point in her chapter on this book is so much of this book was written by a man who never was an office worker, who lived, as a poor farm boy, who rode a horse to college to learn to be a teacher because he was so poor, and spent so much of his life just like scrabbling for something, just to make something work. So a lot of this book was originally written really under the context of, I got to eat. So that adds a context to the book that might not be there. Whether you think that makes this more cynical or more optimistic, that maybe he did really believe that many of the principles he discusses here are a new way of thinking about how you live your life. But anyway, Carnegie was originally born, not spelled the same as the Steel Baron. It was Carenagey, Carnegie. He was born in the early 20th century on, as McHugh calls it, an unprofitable farm in Missouri. In this way, his life was a lot like Walt Disney's early life. He was born at the early 20th century and lived on a crummy old farm. He talks about kind of the idyllic life. He'd go out in the old fishing hole. He lost a finger in a childhood accident. Again, a lot of his life sounds like the children's book Oxcart Man, where it's like the family lives all year just like making the meager supplies on their farm that they will then sell in one day so the dad can buy like a new brush and iron stove. And then they start the whole process again the next year where they got to buy all these things so they can sell them again at the market. Like it's really old-timey America. To the point, like I said, is when he finally went to school to become a teacher, he was riding a horse in his shabby clothes. So a lot of his early days really were about the idea that he wasn't a good public speaker and he had a speech impediment, and he would just practice saying the Gettysburg Address on the way on his horse. And he just really didn't want to look like the poorest kid in the world when he showed up at school. So a lot of his future endeavors really were about trying to cast off his inability to talk to people, not looking like a shabby old farmer. So many of his principles really come kind of from that basis of like being scared that people will find out who he is.
Probably had imposter syndrome.
Possibly.
To the 6th degree, right? I believe he definitely did.
Yeah.
Like we said, he's never been an office salesman. So this book wasn't written by like Don Draper. This was a guy who worked as a salesman for a while. He sold like bacon and soap, I think, and lard, for a little bit of time. He tried to be an actor for a while, and he was a teacher for a while. That's it. He never worked in an office setting. So many of these skills sound like, oh, this guy worked for General Electric or something. Yeah. No, he never did any of that work, even though this is the book that most sort of like business people know about.
But to be honest, I mean, it's harder to, I think, work in door-to-door sales than it is in General Electric, right? I mean, door-to-door sales is hard if you've ever...
I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that job.
Right? So I can imagine that you learn a lot of skills interacting with all of the people, right? Versus just the people at the higher ups if you're on like a higher up corporate gig.
Yeah. From his introduction, he says that this book was written as, he decided he was going to be the one to take all the great leadership and people skills that there were out there, and he was going to put it down as part of his class that he was going to teach at the YMCA. And he went to find a book, and there was no book on leadership skills. There was no book on working with people. And he and his team developed the book by looking at biographies of the great leaders like Julius Caesar, Thomas Edison, Teddy Roosevelt. He interviewed famous people like FDR, Clark Gable, the actor, to talk about how they became great at their skills in human relations. He looked at every psychological work and magazine that talked about leadership or talked about soft skills and working with people. Again, Skinner gets 2 references in this book as sort of like a hotshot young psychologist. You may not have heard about him, but he's going places, folks.
I underlined it. I was like, woo, 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 woo.
Yeah. And he put this together into a short talk, which then as he gave it to these courses in New York, business people would give feedback and he kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. So the way he writes it is there never was a textbook on working with people. And he took every source he could, every primary source, and wrote like the first secondary source on soft skills and working with people. The way McHugh sort of writes the story, it's not too dissimilar, but it's a little less planned. Like this makes it sound like Dale had a mission and it was to do this. Whereas her chapter reads more like Dale thought he could teach a course on this. And while he did think this was an important skill, he really had no idea what to do with his time. Like the YMCA wouldn't even pay him to do these talks. They said, we'll give you 80% of however many tickets we sell. And he did a lecture in 1912 was his first lecture. And he had like 5 or 6 people there and he didn't have enough material to fill the whole class. So he just started asking people, tell me about yourselves. And everyone really liked that part. And he got a lot of positive feedback about the stories people would tell about themselves and their business. And even he then, at least in some interviews, would mention these were desperation methods. Like, I have nothing left to say. What do you think? You know, it's like when you tell your class, turn to a partner and talk about this because I got to fill like 10 minutes or my lecture's not going to make it through the class. And then as the classes went on, he added more participation. He noted people loved to talk about themselves and what made them angry. So that became a huge part of the class. And then over time, used this feedback to forge a class that was all about how to be self-confident, how to sell yourself, how to sell your product, and how to communicate with people. So again, it wasn't necessary. I mean, certainly part of that in writing this book, you know, he does have a lot of references to famous people of the time, and his wife has then added more famous people in the book. So there was a research component, but let's not think that this was like, it just sprung whole cloth from like, I have a mission. This book came from a place of, I want to teach a course. I taught all I know, and it didn't even fill a whole class. And then by listening to people and over time iterating on what I know, I eventually came up with enough material to fill this book. His courses were very popular. He changed his name to Carnegie, like the Steel Baron, that's spelling. Because again, you know, why? Because he either wanted to hide where his origins or he wanted to associate himself with a famous person. It's not really clear. And
the way you say,
that's how they say
Andrew?
it. Andrew Carnegie. That's how they say it on Stuff You Missed in History. And I trust those ladies with my life. So I assume that that's how you pronounce it.
Okay.
A book executive came to his course and said, I want to publish your book. I'm going to publish your course as a book. And he'd actually already been turned down twice on selling this idea of a book. So I think he had been thinking about, I can write this as a book before, but no one had bought him on it. And he was kind of burned by that. Again, I think he really was, you know, at heart, like a poor farm boy and was, you know, sad that people didn't, you know, want to buy his ideas in like the big publishing world. But eventually it did become published. And he himself says that his original rules fit on a postcard, then a leaflet, then booklets. And it took him 15 years to revise what would become this book. And again, I think there's a little bit of self-aggrandizement in that description, but you know, that does somewhat line up with, I think, the real history, the accurate history of where this book came from. He really thought this book would be great to teach people how to deal with others. He meant it to be for all audiences at some point, but again, how much of that was his work and how much of that was his wife going back and trying to make the book relevant over time is unclear. But you know, if you read the book now, it's a lot. There are a lot of examples of professionals. There are a lot of examples of people in the home, like parents. Some of these actually, you know, verge on parenting strategies at times. So really a goal to, you know, make this book applicable to as many people as possible, at least here in America, and at least, you know, within whatever, you know, kind of subclasses that would have been, you know, the most likely to buy his book back then, I guess. Another thing to remember about this book is it came out at the time of the Great Depression. So when, you know, we might say some of these skills seem like they are, you know, how to suck up to people, it really struck a chord in that it was a book that was really telling people who were losing their jobs, who could barely make ends meet, that, hey, it's not your fault. You have what it takes inside you to be a success. All you need to do is hone those skills. And I think I'm just kind of taking this from McHugh's book. A lot of that really spoke to why it was such a huge hit. Because people wanted to hear that, you know, they lost their job. They didn't want to hear that it was, you know, business people's fault because you can't control that. But when you're told, you know what, all these things that you probably can't control, because the average person in America who was struck by the Great Depression, they had nothing to do with investments. Like they probably didn't, have much money in the bank to begin with. It was probably nice to hear, you know what, you can do this. You're going to do it yourself. Don't worry about it. You have the power. It's inside you all along. And this is one of the reasons it became like one of the biggest self-help books and one of the first examples of a self-help book in America. It sort of also became kind of like a social etiquette book as well as kind of a business book. The original book had 3 sections, not the 4 we'll talk about today. 6 ways to make other people like you, which in some form or another in the 1981 edition. 12 ways to win others to your way of thinking. Again, that's in the current edition. And then this one's not exactly 7 rules for making home life happier. That's not specifically written in this edition. And again, a lot of the book is really, when you read it, it's a lot of sort of, research. But again, how much of it is real research? So much is just quotes from people or just themes of famous individuals or interviews of famous individuals. So in parts of it read like a celebrity book. If you didn't love Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln before you read this book, well, you'll love them after reading it because they have so many positive things people say about those two.
It's a lot of anecdata.
A lot of anecdata here. And again, one of the reasons that McHugh puts this in Americanon is that really, the idea of famous people can tell me what to do and influencer culture, that's still a part of who I think we are, for better or worse, as Americans. And a lot of people in the world have adopted this, the idea of people who know what they're doing, we should listen to them. And if we do what they do, we have the power to be as successful as anybody else. And you can't tell me otherwise. And again, is that true? How much does talent play into this versus luck? The idea that you can control your destiny is a very popular American ideal. And this book gave it to Americans when they needed it the most. Whether it was for the best long term, it was a sentiment that I think people did feel happy getting to read for once. It sort of seems ironic in that you would want to think, like, wouldn't it have been better for everyone to realize, no, the reason my life is terrible is because big business people have screwed the American people over with terrible practices, and the government's not doing enough to sort of secure the finances. I'm by no means a historian of the Great Depression, so I'm sure I'm not totally accurate there. But that really isn't what came out of it. It was more the idea of, no, I can do it. I'm going to bootstrap my way as an American to make all my riches come true. And that struck a chord and continues to strike a chord today. I mean, this book sold 300,000 copies in 2016. You'd think this book might sell dribs and drabs at this point, but it was an instant bestseller then. It was actually one of the original paperback books that showed that paperback market, cheaper books were a market that would sell. And it still sells today. It's still on most businessmen's best book lists. Again, businessmen, many men really like this book. It's still, as of 2020, one of the most checked out books in the New York Public Library of all time, even more than Harry Potter.
It's me. I'm just like checking it out and putting it back in, and then checking it out and putting it back in.
And so while this book was immensely popular with book buyers, like you said, Alan, I don't think it was the same review, but there was a New York Times review that McHugh mentions where there was actually mixed reviews. A lot of people didn't like the book. They thought the New York Times quote that McHugh writes is, "There's a subtle cynicism, to be sure, in directions which depend so largely upon flattering the other man's egotism. But Mr. Carnegie disclaims flattery and calls egotism by a sweeter name." So similar to Alan, like you were saying, to Sinclair, I think the reviewers would see this as a cynical suck-up book. And I think we as readers could see it as that. You could choose not to see it as that. Certainly Carnegie himself really goes out of his way to make it clear, like, that's not what I'm trying to say in this book. Whether that is true or not, it's hard to judge. He's probably not the most accurate person to say why he's writing this book, because at the end of the day, he wanted to make money. So you can assume, no, he loved this stuff and he really believed it. You can assume, no, this guy was just trying to make a buck in a hard time and doesn't believe any of this stuff. There is something to be said for being nice to people or listening to people. And we'll get into it when we get into the book as to whether it goes beyond what we think of as sort of caring versus, what was the term Sinclair used or you said, Alan?
Yes, man.
Yeah.
Becoming, instead of a car nay guy, becoming a car yes man.
Yes, exactly. In terms of research as to whether this book works, it's hard to say because it's now become a part of like so many businesses and business practices and supervision books that it's one of those things. It's like a part of everything. So whether or not these are the same principles that actually are research based or not, they kind of lumped in with things that work. And, McHugh mentioned some, light research on the idea that Americans at least do really care about looks how people feel about other people is almost more important than someone's competence. Like, light little studies where people would prefer a hug from someone who's considered charismatic versus someone who's considered competent. Doctors spend more time with patients that they like talking to than they do with patients they don't like talking to. Again, not hard science that these are great supervision practices, but there is something to be said for if people like you, they will probably listen to you more, or at least give you more time, or buy things from you, or be convinced by you, than if they don't like you. I think that is a truism, at least here in America. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it is somewhat true.
And I was just going to add, just for if there are any management like nerds out there who are more interested, again, to be credible to Carnegie, thinking about the other people writing and influencing sort of corporate thinking and the development of sort of modernism in America, you've got like Max Weber and Peter Drucker, who are like out of the Austrian school, and like capitalism and bureaucracy and all this is going to be like the future of like clean, efficient America. And it's really important that our administration and management is like focuses on efficiency rather than relationships. So it is sort of develops in this vacuum of there's nothing else in place. Like sort of the big thinkers during this time are emphasizing like work should be about work, not about relationships. So to his credit, he at least tries to put something into the world as a positive skill rather than as a don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
that's not working.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alan. And I think even some of the more positive critics would say that what this book might have done is take skills that would usually be more considered like soft skills that like women are good at, like, relationship skills, and make it something that men saw a value in, rather than like, no, I'm tough and I'm going to go to work and I'm going to tell people what to do and they're going to do it and I'm going to be negative about like kind of like you were saying, that even, even as irrelevant or relevant as we may think this book could be, it did release the idea that, relationship skills are an important part of business and should be a part of business, which may or may not have been some of the bigger business folk back then may have used these relationship skills, but a lot of people didn't. And a lot of people still don't. I go to work and I want people to do what I tell them. I'm not here to make friends, that kind of attitude, not being very positive and really leading to toxic work cultures. So when we're talking about this book, before we get into that final discussion, what are kind of the take it with a grain of salt points that we wanted to bring up now that we can kind of keep coming back to in our discussion of the content of the book? And I think we all had a few, but Jackie, do you want to?
Yeah, for me, I think it's the examples that were provided, right? There's a ton, we talked about a ton of celebrities, right? And a ton. But if you look very closely at the demographic of the examples, they're all pretty much people like Dale, right? And it doesn't really represent who America is and the populations in America. And so if I was going to rewrite this book, I might, add more examples from different populations, different cultures, different experiences, right? Me as a woman may have a different opinion in some of the principles and how to interact with people, or, than Dale might have read about. So I think the examples I took as a grain of salt with me thinking, okay, these are things that need to be updated.
Okay.
What about you, Alan? You're shaking your head. You got some head shakes.
My two caveats, I suppose, would be the first one generally about why you recommend this book and why recommending this book as a behavior analyst can be problematic. And that's sort of more divorced from content-specific examples. Again, just knowing that it's important that if someone has no way to sort of function socially successfully, this is a way, not the way. But, and this sort of got back to our original conversation where poor Rob laid into you really hard about this book not being a good example. It's so over-recommended, in my opinion, that it has become the way. And thinking about people who, whether they're queer, they're on the spectrum, they have ADHD, like all, maybe if African-American, Asian-American, so many different varieties of people that we have in behavior analysis that we We want professionals to be as diverse as possible. Having a book full of white male examples is horrendously off-putting to a lot of people. So that's my one thought on that side of things. And then, content specific of like, man, it's so slimy sometimes if you have a cynical interpretation of what he's trying to do. I will give him the benefit of the doubt that he's not trying to be smarmy, but it still is a very like slimy, sleazy approach to getting what you want. And that's important to know because you don't want to come off that way if people don't appreciate this approach. Yeah, so those are my two sort of thoughts on why this book is problematic for supervision.
Yeah, I mean, the feeling I got from this book is that he's talking about a lot of this from his own perspective or from perspective of people who are a lot like him. And these very well may be good techniques that worked well for him or for people like him. But we have to think about the fact that the world that he was operating within, you're saying this book was written in 1936. He worked on it for 15 years, right? So we're all the way back in the 20s, was one that was largely populated by white men. And that did not allow for a lot of variance within the population, but also these may be strategies that work if you have that sort of closed loop, right? Of just white men talking to white men, right? But when you introduce other variables and bring in discrimination, bigotry into those loops, these strategies aren't going to work in the same way necessarily anymore. And that piece is completely missing from this book. And I think that if you were to attempt these strategies and you aren't in a closed feedback loop of white men talking to white men, then they may not work in the same way. They may backfire on you, or you may face a lot of other types of discrimination that aren't discussed here.
Diana, the one example that I keep coming back to is one of the principles that's like smile.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I know in popular culture now when men are like, come on, just smile, I think, and that's like pretty offensive to women overall. Right.
Yeah.
So when
I think there's a context. I'm imagining the context in which you would say, come on, just smile, Jackie. And I think there are two. One is like, I'm doing a business seminar where I suggest you smile. And the other's like, I'm some dude. And I'm like, come on, you're so pretty when honest, you smile.
As a woman, I feel it the same way.
Really? Okay.
Yep. So as a woman,
wow, okay.
Right, as like a business person, if I was at work and someone's like, can you smile? I'd be like, fuck off. Right? Yeah. Like
this is a children's podcast, Jack. You gotta watch that.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's fine.
I would, the function of that, of what I perceive that behavior would be the exact same in business as it would be on the street.
Even if it were like a seminar that you paid to go to that had a diverse group of people.
100%.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Because I don't need to be smiling to be friendly. Right. And so if I heard that, I would black it out. And I got a little prickly based on my own, experiences, even though I'm a smiley gal. Right. But based on my previous experiences, when I read that part, I wanted to rip it out of the book.
See, I like smiling. Smiling is my favorite.
Smiling's my favorite too, but I don't need someone to tell me to smile to be more professional.
I hear you there. I hear you there. Yeah. That is it's a good point.
Or the example of just tell the secretary your dress is pretty, but then say, now don't let that go to your head.
Ugh. I don't remember that one from the book.
Interesting how you don't
remember the lady at the post office. He said, I love your curls or something.
Oh yeah. No, that was a guy.
Okay.
Well, and sort of think about our field and what we're known for. The example of like eye contact being something that we really overemphasize to the point of being problematic and exclusionary of other cultural viewpoints on what eye contact means and doesn't mean. It's very similar. Like Jackie, people won't see it, but my head was shaking so hard while you were saying that smile, it just needs to be ripped out of the book because Rob, you gave sort of two examples that are easily discriminated against, but those people aren't the problem. Bosses who may or may not want to be helpful, telling you to smile could come off as harassment or harassing in a way that is unintended, but it is important that we avoid. It's not on the part of us as people who have had bad experiences being told to smile to suck it up and know that that's not what the person meant. Like at this point, it's important that managers and supervisors be responsible for what they say and the feedback they give.
Gotcha. So it's not the idea of smiling so much as it is the idea of being told this is the way you need to present yourself to the world. That is the part it makes people feel uncomfortable. Am I understanding that part right? Because again, that's not. I think I hear what you're saying. I'm trying to have a level of understanding, not because I think. It's again, I'm coming from a place of privilege, so it's not something I've ever had to think about. This book was written for me. Some people love Fruit Loops. I love the loop you were talking about, Diana, the white male discussion loop. That's my favorite breakfast cereal. I think it's so easy for me. So I appreciate it. And again, I don't expect anyone here to be tell me about the discrimination, folks. Tell me what an interesting stuff. I don't want you're all my colleagues and friends and family. So I don't need you to serve that role, but I do appreciate when I can have these discussions and learn from them.
Maybe the piece that is missing is thinking about there very often in these types of interactions are going to be unstated power dynamics, either between a boss and an employee, right? Or there's going to be layered on, but again, unstated social dynamics at play here as well between groups that may be underrepresented or groups that hold more power. So if someone who's in that position of power is dictating how the other person needs to act and is saying that they need to act in a way that's the way that person in power acts, right? Then the implication is that your culture, your background isn't good enough, and you need to instead mimic what I'm doing in order to get ahead or move up, right? And it comes into, like you were talking about earlier, Alan, with the kind of masking of who you are in order to fit in and then be able to advance.
Excellent. Man, I'm fortunate to have you all here. Otherwise, I just talk about boring historical facts because I love learning these things. This is great. In terms of my big questions, I really wanted to bring to my read of this book because I'd read it before. This is the second and a half-ish time I think I'd read it in the past 4 or 5 years. Really, I'm going to be lavish in my praise to Alan, who sent a great link of a nice talk. I'll have it in the show notes. But Dr. Liz Fong, we've had on the show, Sean Capel and Helen Adedipe, about talking about race and diversity and kind of using that as a springboard to think of some critical questions that I probably would not have thought of on my own, and appreciated having a different perspective to help me understand what in this book might be more complex or have a context that no longer makes some of these recommendations appropriate. So smiling was one that you all talked about. I thought that you made a very strong point that when we get to that section of the book, we'll mention it's in the book, and then we don't need to talk about it anymore if people don't want to talk about it anymore because we don't think it's one that would be relevant in the future. And we've discussed why already. But what I took from that talk, from kind of some pre-talk we all did as a group, really the idea of, again, this book being written for white men at a very specific time. And as much as it's been updated, it was updated by someone who, was the wife of, who has an agenda, whether, again, it's a cynical or positive agenda.
40 years ago.
But 40 years ago. Yeah, exactly. That is not going to take into account a lot of
lots changed.
Cultural competent, theory or thoughts on how to make a diverse workplace. The idea that, again, a lot of the thoughts in here are ones that people of color have often been penalized for doing, So again, we can say, you should smile, you should express yourself. And historically, a lot of people of color are penalized for that, or they're punished for doing that, sharing their thoughts, or try to talk to them about their need. Well, people might not like that. And so many of these recommendations might work for you if you're one of the good old boys in the business, but are going to get you fired if you're not one of those people, or you're not, in the same homogenized group that's in charge of of the company or the sales group, whatever it happens to be. And really just trying to think about where is my privilege and my historical learning context going to make some of these points relevant when, like you said, Alan, they're not always going to be relevant. So while some of these points may be good in certain times with certain people, that doesn't make them great supervision practices. That makes them, like supervision party trick, or, pull this out of the bag of tricks if need be, or if you find yourself in this setting. And then also the idea that this is a book that's so old, it's not going to take into account a lot of our modern discussions of what makes a positive working environment. There's nothing here about, how do you avoid or how do you reflect on microaggressions, or how are you culturally competent? Because certainly while some of the points that Carnegie makes about sharing, an actual interest in the other person, you may be able to say, this is sort of a precursor to some of what we talk about in our discussions of cultural competence, listening to our consumers. It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same. It's sort of a similar, but it's not coming from the same place. Therefore, that doesn't mean it serves the same function. And taking that into account. And like you were saying, Diana, too, what are leader power differentials? There's nothing in here about power differentials at all. The way Carnegie makes it sound like is if you're smiling and if you say something positive and are interested in the boss's yacht collection, bam, you're in. You're in like Flint. You're going to be the boss's best friend, regardless of the fact that you're like a wage slave and not the CEO of a major train company or whatever the heck you'd be in his anecdotes. And again, that's not always the case. There is a power differential there. And again, does that mean that you are really doing the suck up job rather than trying to share a vested interest in the other person in the goal of everyone getting what they want out of the business deal? Again, that sounds positive. And I'd like to think it's a positive way to do business if everyone's going to win. That's my idea of customer service. It's my idea of a good business. Everybody wins. The consumer wins. The supplier wins. But that's not how everyone does business. And to just assume that's the way everyone does business is really, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, and it's not appropriate. And it's not taking into account a lot of structures that have led us to many of the conflicts that we are still dealing with in the country. So those are some of the kind of the big points I was really trying to bring into my reading of it, whether I did a great job of bringing them into my discussions or whether I just fell into the aw-shucksmanship of learning about how, Billy the garage salesman was able to make his quota by getting all the pallets to the dock or whatever, the anecdote was be. I can't say for sure, but I did try to put that into my conversation, and I hope it will come through in our conversations as a group. All right. Now, before we even talk more about this book, I think we need to take a little break. And then when we come back, we're going to get into 9 suggestions to get the most out of this book and a little bit more in-depth discussion of part 1 of how to win friends and influence people, fundamental techniques in handling people. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie as part of our Supervision September. But of course, part of Supervision September is earning those sweet, sweet Supervision CEs. And by listening to this episode, you are going to be able to earn one Supervision CE. All you need to do is finish listening and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, GET-CEUS, and enter in some information, including 2 code words we've hidden in the episode. The first of those code words is butter, BUTTER. I've thought of this one because when we're talking about the Great Depression, people used to have to stand in bread and butter lines to get these essentials because things were so bad. Butter is also a delicious spread. Dale Carnegie sold lard. I don't think he sold butter exactly, but similar ideas. Everyone loves butter. It's not good for you, I guess, but it's delicious. Butter. All right. So now, after going through more than half our episode, we're actually going to start talking about the book itself. Dale starts off with these great little suggestions about getting the most out of this book. I think the one I like the most is the idea you could read it over and over and over again. If you're listening and you're like, I don't know if I want to read this book over and over again, you know what? You can listen to this podcast over and over and over again, right?
I would never read this book over again. Just saying. I
mean, I've read it twice. It's easy. It's an easy read. But
it is written in a very conversational style.
Yeah. Yep.
It's I like his style in that sense, right? It is kind of fun.
This also is a very much a doing.
Right, like book. No, like exclamation points.
I like when he critiques someone's letter about that's what, whatever. That's a terrible letter. You're right.
Yeah, one thing I do like about the book is each part has principles related to it. Mm-hmm. So for like part 1, the 3 principles are: don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Give honest and sincere appreciation. Principle 2 and principle 3, arouse in the other person an eager want. So that's how we can handle people. Mm-hmm. And these are the 3 principles that part 1 talks about.
Yeah. So we've got our parts. We'll talk about part 1 and then we'll finish up the book on part 2 of our episode. But the structure really is: here's the principle. Here's the chapter. Each chapter is a principle. Like you said, Jackie, those are the 3 principles we'll be talking about tonight. And then there are a lot of fun anecdotes. Some of them are a little more research-based, or this is something Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter. And some of them are clearly someone told you this in one of your courses, and you thought it was a great anecdote about how the principle is used, and you wrote it down. But that does make it a little easier that if you are reading this book and you're like, I'm going to do everything this book says, okay, you probably could pretty easily take almost every one of these ideas and go do it in your workplace. We're telling you that's probably not the greatest idea to just take this book as is and just do everything it says. However, you could. You could do it if you so desired, or you wanted to write an article about how effective you felt that was. But, again, that we're not condoning that. That's you do you when it comes to how to win friends and influence people, I guess. So part 1, fundamental techniques in handling people. We're just going to talk about each one and sort of what we liked, didn't like about it, and what we think is still relevant to modern supervision. With, some sections do kind of start to cannibalize older sections. So kind of as the book goes on, we're going to get a little briefer with some of these discussions. So how to handle people. And these are really the big 3 ideas. So again, if you read these and you say, man, my boy Dale loves humanity and really sees working with people in your business, whatever it is, as an amazing skill, and he loves everybody, great. Then these are really positive, optimistic principles. If you see it as this guy's trying to make a buck on a supervision book, and most of these are old white man ideas, you know what? Some of them aren't going to come off quite as positively or would even necessarily be appropriate. So principle 1, don't criticize, condemn, or complain. And this is where our first Skinner reference comes into play, where Dale actually discusses the principle of reinforcement as more rapidly allowing others to learn new behavior and retain it than punishment for their bad behavior. So there's Skinner, and reinforcement is even mentioned here. So principle 1, I think, are we all of the mindset that the idea of if you want people to do the things you want them to do, or you want them to improve in their skills, we want to focus less on criticizing and complaining about what people do and more on what they're doing right and using structured feedback, which isn't mentioned here. But what do we say?
I agree on that, but I also feel like critical feedback is important. Mm-hmm. So without, for principle 1, I would say, don't criticize, condemn, or complain unnecessarily. But as it relates to the job set, without critical feedback or constructive feedback, your employees are never going to get better, right? On the things that they already are not doing, because you won't have the opportunity to reinforce their appropriate behaviors because they're not engaging in them.
So maybe don't condemn, complain, and criticize at appropriate times and in appropriate manners. Yeah. Would you rephrase it that way, Jackie? Does that sound?
I would say use constructive feedback wisely.
Okay.
Right. Because it's important, and you might need to criticize someone in how he's written in this book in order to better the performance of the employee, right? Because it felt to me in this principle that people just innately knew what they needed to do and they just weren't doing it, which is never the case, right? Because I always assume that people don't know what they're supposed to do at their job, right? So if a new behavior technician comes in, I can't be like, you know how to do discrete trial.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't. And I don't even assume that people know how to interact with other people because, right, that's a skill set that you need to learn and it's not inherent, right, in other people. So even there, we might need to be giving constructive feedback on how people are interacting with people.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I think part of his point here, too, is thinking about how you're delivering what you need to say. Because you can say something in such a way that it's puts someone on the defensive, it's off-putting, and they're not going to be able to listen to the criticism that you provide because you basically hurt their feelings, right? So he's saying that too, is don't go into it being so confrontational that the person can't respond in a way that's going to be constructive for them because you've hurt their feelings. But think about the pitch and the tenor with which you need to provide your criticism and match it only as strong as it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just thinking about this in the context of supervision, and I don't want to do this for all the points, but this is the one that I think is most important to bring this up. It is necessary for people that are being mentored to have a space to complain, to even potentially get emotional if that is a safe option with the people around. So if a supervisor recommended this book, I was like, you might want to use some of this because I don't want to hear you complain anymore. It could come off that way.
Right.
And it's not helpful to someone who is trying to, it just goes back to that power dynamic of if you're dealing with other people, be mindful that you're not complaining too much. But as someone who is supervising, knowing that has a limit, that it is, I think that is a role of a mentor to be a sounding board, to be a safe person to be complained to, because how else can someone get feedback on how to improve things?
Mm-hmm. I even think that Dale Carnegie would agree that it is appropriate to complain at times. So I think we all agree that it's not don't ever complain. It's if you want someone to improve behavior, complaining at them or about them won't do it. But there are times and there are contexts where complaining is appropriate. I mean, he wrote half this book based on people in his classes complaining to him about their jobs and the people they worked with. So I think he would say there's a time and a place to complain. If people didn't complain, he wouldn't have a book, right?
Well, that's why he doesn't want other people to take advantage. I'm just kidding. But wouldn't that be funny? Don't let
They'll write a follow-up.
This is my market.
How to better influence people. I do also think this principle is interesting in terms of talking about context. And I don't know if any of you read this or if I'm reading too deep into it, but I love this anecdote of good old Honest Abe. A lot of Honest Abe anecdotes in this book where he did not criticize General Meade. And I did a little Wikipedia research to double check this was historically accurate. I know, I went on Wikipedia. The idea that he was the general who was in charge of the Union Army around the time of Gettysburg, and how he had the opportunity when the South had just been beaten at Gettysburg and they're back up against the river. Like they couldn't cross the river. It was too flooded. And he should have, and got a lot of criticism, he should have just attacked the Union Army, should have just attacked them and rolled over the South, end of the Civil War right there, rather than having another 2 years of Civil War. And Lincoln, rather than writing, Dear General Meade, you're the worst general ever. How dare you not beat the Confederacy? It was so easy. Took the time to say, I'm not going to yell at this guy because I need him to keep being a good general. And if all I do is write to him and tell him what a terrible job he did, he's not going to be able to continue doing a good job or might speak out ill of me. And really went to the idea of, this guy just fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, which even at the time was like a big deal. And I think, we remember it as part of American history as like the turning point of the Civil War. It's a huge battle. So we don't know why Meade wouldn't go attack the South. Maybe the men were crying. They were like, no, I can't fight anymore. They're shell shocked. Maybe he didn't think they had the supplies. Maybe he thought the South was going to do something. General Lee was a tricky commander. Maybe he thought he had some secret plan that he was going to beat him with, and he didn't want to get crushed right after. There were a lot of contexts. And so he didn't yell at General Meade. And then Meade actually did go on to do more in the context of the Civil War. And that's what I looked up on Wikipedia. Like, did that really happen? Did any of this happen? Was he really in charge? Is this made up? So again, possibly this was a very true anecdote in that regard. And I do like that idea because I think a lot of that has to do with being a good supervisor. The idea that while criticism is going to be a part of your job, if you're not willing to take context into play or think about, the organism always being right, you are just going to find yourself complaining all the time. Because at the end of the day, when you're working with other professionals, why can't they just do their jobs? It's so easy to go to that because it's hard to think about other people's perspectives. That's a skill you have to practice to become fluent in. And I think it's relevant here. So again, whether anyone else read this, whether this was actually what Dale Carnegie meant, I did pick that little part out of Principle 1 here. Also, if you want to learn more about the Teapot Dome scandal, Principle 1's chapter got some real great. Alan shaking his head, no, does not want to hear about that.
I found those types, I was just like, oh, dying. Oh, like head nodding.
And like, Rob, this is an example of like, I would put this book down very quickly.
Same.
Honest Abe and Teapot
William
Dome,
Jennings Bryan.
Yeah, these examples, while perhaps more meaningful to you, Rob, or even to me, like you and I are similar in many ways, but dissimilar in other ways. I don't want to hear about historical figures and how someone in the Civil War, a general at that in the Civil War, was approached about how they didn't slaughter a bunch of civilians potentially. Like, again, I know you want to be very like generous, which I understand, but for someone having to slog through this for supervision, it's horrible examples and not relevant to modern life.
I make this promise. If anyone out there listening, if you're like an RBT or BCABA and you're like, I hope Rob's my supervisor someday, I promise you, I will share multiple examples about the Teapot Dome scandal in our supervision meetings. That's my guarantee. So now no one will want to be supervised by me ever again.
I see.
The Warren Harding administration comes up all the time. It's very important. All right. Yeah.
I was like, gosh, there's like a whole like wealth of like what to them was like pop culture, right? Like recent historical events I know nothing about.
Nope.
It's like lost.
They're not lost to time, but
almost. I mean, who knows about
lost to relevance.
Lost to relevance.
Lost to interest.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Principle 2, give honest and sincere appreciation, which I think is the principle that you either think that Carnegie's full of it, or you really believe that he sees being positive and talking to other people about how much you like them and the work they're doing is genuine or not. And I think behavior analysis gets this like, why are you giving kids cookies to act like this? Like, God's gross. What a gross science you are. And again, I understand why people would think that about our field. That is not what we are trying to do. But
a lot of other options other than edible reinforcement.
Beyond just the edible reinforcement. The idea that we're like bribing people. Or you're bribing kids to do what you want. It's
on the when I read this, I'm like, yes. Right? But I would have changed the word appreciation to feedback. Right? Give honest and sincere feedback. Because as a supervisor, right, you need to be giving feedback both constructive and positive, and you need to be honest, right? And your supervisees will also know if you don't mean it, right? So as if I was rewriting this book, maybe I should, wouldn't that be hilarious? If I was rewriting this book in Principle 2, I would cross off appreciation because that sounds slimy to me, right? Like, but if I write give honest and sincere feedback, that gives me, it puts that soft human skills in with something that I have to do as part of supervision, which is deliver that feedback. That's how kind of my take on it was. As a
I hear your point there, Jackie. I think I kind of like appreciation. I think the issue becomes, this context of, hey, we're doing a podcast where we're critically discussing a book. The term appreciation, I think we understand what's meant by that. We understand how we would or would not use that. Like, we would not use that in our actual work with people as supervisors. But I think if you're a business person reading this...
But people would, Rob. That's the thing, is that your history isn't what everyone's history is, right?
No, I understand that, but I do think, at least in this section, when we talk about feedback, especially if you're like, I've never managed anyone before and I'm a business person, I'm going to read this book. I think appreciation captures, there's like a connotation to it that I think captures more what we want to see in feedback. Whereas a lot of people, they hear feedback. What do they hear? They hear complain. So I think feedback's one of those terms that we understand how to use it precisely because it's something we've taken multiple hours of coursework on and read multiple books on. But the average person, when they hear feedback, I think they still think complain. And maybe I'm not giving people enough credit, but I don't think everyone understands when we say feedback, what we're talking about with feedback. They think feedback is, I'm going to tell you how you're doing everything wrong. And you're going to learn from that just by my kind of crapping on the job you're doing. So I don't disagree that it might not be the right word, but I also, there's a part of me that does sort of like that in this section, in this very specific section, as like broad idea of what's in the book.
And again, I'm just going to smack you down there, Rob, of like, we don't have to choose between those two words. And the word appreciation
That's true.
is overloaded down and has a lot of, you talk about connotation. It has become sort of smarmy and associated with insincere feedback from a supervisor. Like, I really appreciate what you do. But again, if you're recommending this book to a supervisee who might need this skill, they're not going to discriminate that this is not the correct word to use. No, I think Jackie's right. The word appreciation is not the good word. Feedback could be better, of like talking about areas of improvement and successes, and which even now that has sort of this smarminess to it that I don't appreciate. But yeah, I don't like the word appreciation because it is overloaded.
Okay.
I feel like time and again in this book, I felt like his goals are different than what our goals are usually in our field, right? Because these are written mostly from like a business perspective. So like, how can we have this sort of business transaction and have it go the best for both parties, right? And it's going to go best for the both parties when we get as, chummy as possible. We find things that we have in common and we can talk about those together. And I can present my business proposition to you in a way that's going to be beneficial for you. But of course, it's also beneficial for me. But that's not the kind of work that we do in our field, right? Like, we're a social services field. And what we really should be looking at is how we can best serve the families and clients that we work with. And then for our trainees or supervisees, how can we teach them the skills that they need to be the best clinicians long-term? And for both of those groups, we're looking at how can we establish a meaningful relationship with them that's going to pull in the richness of their personal experience and allow us to help them in the best possible way, which is a much deeper, intended to be a much more long-term type of relationship than what I think most of the tips in this book are getting at, right? In this chapter, I think that he is sincere in his continued underlining of the fact that he feels that you have to be sincere, right? And he says it again and again. You can't just flatter someone and think that that's going to make you friends with them, right? Like, if you're going to give them a compliment or you're going to say something that's complimentary, I said the same thing 2 times, then you have to mean it, right? So I think that he's coming from it from a sincere place, but whether that's going to benefit you long-term and the types of, I think, deeper, meaningful relationships that we need to establish in our field is maybe still sort of a superficial view.
I think some of the choice of quotes in this section would make me agree with you, Diana. This was coming from a place of, I think, like a positivity. I like the Emerson quote he puts in: "Every man I meet is my superior in some way. In that I learn of him." If we were just talking about just tell people nice things so that they do what you want, that's not the quote you would choose. Right. It's really understanding that everyone is better than you in something, and we should always be learning from the people. And if we think of our relationships with people as learning opportunities, we're always going to be able to make pretty positive relationships, whether they're long-term friendships, short-term working relations, whatever they are. And we're also coming into that relationship with an idea that this this individual has something amazing about them. And that's exciting. Rather than this person, whether it's your supervisor or your client, is below me. I have more power and knowledge. They should do what I tell them to do because I am the expert in the field. And that was a huge hallmark of behavior analysis for a long time. We're the smart people, do what we say, and your kids will be normal. And that's not what any of us want to do.
We're promoting.
And that's not what we're promoting, certainly. And even if it's a family that's coming to you at their lowest point because things are in such crisis now, you still have something to learn from them. And whether it's supervisee, I just got out, I'm just taking my grad school classes. I don't know anything about this behavior analysis stuff, or I don't know as much as you do, supervisor. There's still going to be something you're going to learn from it, whether it's just the feedback you learn or how that individual learns, as a supervisee. There's something to be gained from that. If you want a more relevant or more recent example than Ralph Waldo Emerson, I also say if you watch the first season of Ted Lasso, there's a very nice example of, I don't know, Alan, have you seen this, Alan? I can't tell from your expression. No, where Ted Lasso is playing darts with somebody who thinks Ted Lasso, because if you haven't seen it, he's like a soccer guy. And he's like always optimistic and he has an accent. He sounds so friendly. And he's playing darts with this like really smarmy guy who is probably not being, not using flattery ever rather than actual sincere appreciation. And he has a Walt Whitman quote about being curious, not judgmental. And it's just this great scene about how some, individuals with power tend to not think much of people, or they look at just what they see. They never are curious about who is this person? Why would I want to know them? What is it that makes them special? And that is why he has the positive outcome in that scene. But I love, if you haven't watched Ted Lasso season 1, finish listening to this podcast, then you go watch season 1. Then you come back and listen to part 2 and watch season 2. I haven't seen season 2 yet. I don't know if it's good.
For some trendy Walt Whitman philosophy.
Well, it's Ted Lasso saying it. That is okay. That's a recent comment. All right. You can listen about me talk about Ted Lasso and the Teapot Dome scandal as my supervisor. Real exciting. I'm swinging all over the place.
Do you want to tell them why I haven't seen other than the first 2 episodes of Ted Lasso?
Because I watched it with our sister-in-law until like 3 a.m. and just in one binge, and everyone else went to bed.
They watched it all night.
We did. We watched the whole thing.
And just because I know we've got to get through this section, but I think Diana was very succinct in sort of my feelings about this book is I would never use this book in supervision because it is so far removed from relevancy to what we need to do, which goes back to our original very intense SmackDown conversation of this book is not good for supervision for many reasons, in my point of view.
Okay.
So,
but to your credit, Alan,
I
you
appreciate
read it
that,
and
Diana.
you're discussing it. You're being very open. I know you're not loving it, but you've read the book multiple times now. So when you're saying I'm not using this book, you're coming from a real place of knowledge and experience. I'm trying to teach my 13-year-old that, who just tends to complain about things. And I'm like, you don't know anything. You're 13. You didn't watch the movie or read the book. All right. Anyway,
He hasn't seen Ted Lasso.
He hasn't seen Ted. Well, that's MA, Diana. I'm a good parent. I don't let my children watch MA. Sorry, that was very judgy.
Yeah,
Principle 3. Arouse in the other person an eager want, which is a creepy phrasing.
AKA motivation operation. Motivation. Right. So let's just cross that out and write motivational operations. You're not
gonna be an all-time American bestseller if you have a principle called motivating operations.
You don't know that.
Oh, Jack, how many of your grad students are like, ooh, the lecture on motivating operations?
Actually,
Tell me
all
more.
of them. I try to avoid that one, and they all want to do it, Diana. Am I right?
I know.
They're trying to arouse an eager want.
And the other person, an eager one, is almost iambic pentameter. So I do like it for that reason.
Yeah. The word arouse creeps me out. I'm just saying, when you're talking about business supervision, nobody should be talking about being aroused.
Yeah, this again, I think the way what Carnegie's getting at, and again, choice of quotes makes me think that this is genuine. Henry Ford quote, the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. So this isn't about like give people what they want. It's about understanding what is the function of this individual's current desire, why they won't buy from you, why they don't want to agree with you, why they're not interested in working with you. Like what is the reason? And not coming from a place of this person doesn't agree with me because they're dumb or I don't like them or that we're never going to work together. It is coming from that perspective of this person has a reason for doing what they want, for doing what they're doing. If I understand what that is, I can better, and again, not use that to my benefit solely, but I can figure out what it is I am able to add to their environment to make their, have them listen to me or work with me. And it might be small, it might be big. But I do think this is an important skill. And again, you can read this. If you don't have the context, you're going to read this and say, oh, I'll just tell the people, I'll give them what they want, and then they'll buy from me. I don't think what Carnegie is talking about, nor do I think if that is what he's talking about, that would be an appropriate supervisory goal. But understanding that people have different perspectives, people are coming to every interaction with a different learning history and context. And if you can understand what that is, then you can make a better working relationship. Again, whether you want to see it cynically as you can get the person to do what you want, or at least try to better understand what it is you're trying to share, I think is more what we would say, because again, we're not trying to tell them do this because if you don't, bad things will happen. We're trying to tell our families, our supervisees, I understand why you are doing things this way. What about doing this? It might let you do things the way you want them to go and in a more ethical way or appropriate way or efficient way. We're trying to help. But again, that's my perspective of what this principle is trying to say. I think we've all come to some disagreements as to whether we think that is what Carnegie's trying to say, whether that's still relevant in terms of supervision.
No. So this is the thing, and I want to be very clear. I should have made this clear earlier. I think that Carnegie is being very sincere. I don't think that's relevant. I think his intentions are completely irrelevant about if this book is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Just like we were talking about with the feedback of like smile. It doesn't matter ultimately that the supervisor doesn't intend for being, why don't you smile more? It's not relevant that the manager says that innocuously as just a like, hey, be more approachable, maybe smile more, that kind of thing. It's important that this is no longer relevant to modern society in outside like business. And that, as sort of Dan was saying, like we work in social services, there's multiple layers to this. And again, even if he is sincere, and I believe that he is, the way he sums it up and the examples he gives, it's still problematic. Because he has the quote of like, tomorrow when you approach somebody, think, how do I get them to sort of do what I want? Again, it comes up. Before you speak, pause and ask yourself, how can I make this person want to do it? Which is probably like that's off-putting given sort of the last 100 years of history and our understanding of how business and socialization works. And so I'm just going to toss this book aside again.
Alan, even the section where he's right, he's got this is what I think we mentioned it, the letter where this is a letter that like a business wrote to one of my, people who took my course, and going over all the things in the letter where the letter writer is pretty much saying, you need to do this because this is how my business is going to help. And all those little parentheticals about what the business, the receiver of the letter must be thinking, like, who does this guy think he is? Like, I don't care about what he wants. Like, I'm not even going to live. And the point at which the person actually asked them to do something in the letter, it's so late in the letter that like, no, you can't write a letter like this. Even that's, I love that. I felt that was such a great like crystallization of how much do we do this in our day, where we spend so much time telling the person, this is what I want you to do in a fashion.
This is how your problem is affecting me.
Yeah. Like so much of our, and people who don't know how to use feedback appropriately, so much of what they think is feedback is just, this is how what you're doing makes me sad. Stop doing it that way. And the idea of like, no one cares. Like, I mean, maybe that person will change what they're doing right now. But if so, it's more because they don't want to hear about you complaining at them again. Like you're so aversive, like the negative versus positive reinforcement when it comes to supervision. I thought that still was pretty relevant. Again, the example, maybe not. And if you're right, if I were a supervisee and this were like my first example of learning about supervision, I don't think I would pick that up from this book. So in that regard, Alan, I think you're totally right in that like this isn't anyone's first supervision book. But I do think that section brought up to speed or brought up to a more relevant context, I think does still capture a lot of what we would like to teach our supervisees in terms of how to approach an issue.
Right. So you as a supervisor can glean that. Expecting a supervisee to glean that, it's too much.
I totally agree with you there.
Inappropriate.
Yeah, this is not a book to teach supervision. This is a book for people who know how to do supervision to read, to get more context and historical view on what supervision has been, to bring to their supervision. Yeah, it's kind of like as much as it's billed as like the baby book for everyone in supervision. I think we're all agreeing that like this actually, given its age, does not. It's like, you don't
easily misinterpreted.
Yeah. High school history, you don't necessarily read the Constitution, or you do. You mostly have your teacher tell you what's in the Constitution. And then later you come back and read the text of the Constitution and say, oh, everything I learned was wrong, but now I have life experience to tell me why. Okay. All right. So those are our 3 principles. Anything else on our 3 principles before we kind of wrap up this first part?
I also might change if I was, you've asked me what I might change here. I might change the title of the chapter, like the part, techniques for handling people, just sounds also like not how I would want my supervisees to see me as a supervisor, as they're just a thing to be handled.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I wrote all over my book.
So Jackie, if you were Doc Brown, you'd make a time machine so you could go back in time just to be like, Dale, I got some word choice options I want you to consider.
And if I was like, oh, I wonder how my boss thinks about me, and I read this, and it's like, oh, he's just trying to handle me like I'm like some, and anything, right? It doesn't speak humanely to me, right? So I would maybe promote it like how to interact with people or how to develop rapport. I would try to think of something different than just handling.
Even just like work with people, right? I hear you there.
Make it simpler with working with people, right? How to do something like that. But the word handle also gave me like little prickles.
It does have like a weird power dynamic. Yeah,
like, oh, I'm the everything, right? We're not a team. I'm the thing. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, and Rob, I think sort of related, the approach that you take even as a host, I believe that you're like very sincere, but even a couple times now we've talked about, I think we're all in agreement. You're not trying to be problematic in that. But I will say that for me, that has too often been associated with I've heard your point, but I'm not going to consider it relevant or change my behavior or change what's going on. And again, I feel I can say that because you know each other well enough now that I'm not trying to be malicious.
And I will accept that. I will accept that feedback from where it's coming from, and I will say I definitely appreciate hearing that. So thank you.
Yeah, but just a classic example of you're trying to build consensus, and which relates to some of these principles, but the sort of classic approaches of like what you say to recognize consensus and to move forward with consensus, some of those techniques are outdated. And or at least one can be varied in how one does that. Because if you always use the one approach, if it's an approach that other people have used to be dismissive, it's going to be problematic because people will have to take that extra effort to be like, is Rob trying to be this way? No, he's not. But it takes a lot of like effort and generosity on the part of someone who is being supervised, and hearing that they have to give you credit, which is not, you don't want the people that you're working with and supervising to constantly have to forgive you for, that's not the purest example of a microaggression, but in a like sort of neurodiverse world, maybe it is. Of language is important.
I appreciate that, Alan. Thank you. It's not something I ever thought of, and it is nice to know that. Well, it's nice to know there's always something new to learn about. I appreciate hearing that. Thank you for sharing. No, that's not what I meant. You. Sorry about that. I appreciate your feedback. Thank you. I'm gonna leave it there.
Yeah. And it just seemed relevant to what we're talking about.
Very true.
As a supervisor, as someone who's leading a discussion, you should be aware of your own behavior. And that is what Carnegie is trying to say. Mm-hmm. But it's now, his recommendations now seem trite and insincere because he stresses sincerity so much.
All right. Well, we made it through one part of the book, so that was good. But that's why we have 2 parts, because this is a book that has a lot going for it. And I'm glad that we were able to get through a lot of context, because otherwise I think this would be hard, especially if you're a listener who's never read this book before, to understand, like, well, it sounds nice to me, or it sounds terrible to me. I think you could go either way. And having a context, I think, allows for a nice critical discussion of what's here and what is or is not working. And I think for various, things we've talked about, there are some areas where we are 100% in disagreement and some areas where we're in maybe a little more. But that's important because this is such I'm going to say important book in the sense of historically important. And I'm glad we can bring that level of discussion to it. It is fun to think every time we do one of these book clubs, we want this to be the pod. No, you're going to listen to this podcast and that's it. Don't listen. You don't need to listen to any others. Don't even read the book. Just listen to us talk about it for however many hours. But this is too many hours. We need to wrap up so that we can finish. And then the next time, come back next week, we're going to be talking all about part 2 of How to Win Friends and Influence People. And 3 and 4. Yeah, it's our part 2, but it's Carnegie's 2, 3, and 4. And with that, we have wrapped up our discussion. Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in getting Supervision CE for listening to this podcast, you'll need code word 2, and that is TAFT, T-A-F-T. He used to be a president. I don't think Dale Carnegie thinks very highly of Taft. If you read this book, he kind of sees him as being a whiner and he doesn't get much done. He's not as cool as Teddy Roosevelt, who he super loves. So Taft is the code word. And with that, let's finish up the episode. We want to say thank you so much for listening to part 1 of our discussion. Certainly thanks to Alan for joining us on the book club, and of course, Jackie and Diana. If you're interested in listening to more ABA Inside Track, we'd love it if you subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us a lot of other places too. You can find us on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to any of the pieces that we discussed tonight, as well as places to find our old episodes and to purchase CEs. These episodes come out on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can find us on social media. We're everywhere as ABA Inside Track, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. You can certainly feel free to email us with thoughts or your own readings of the book at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. And if you like this book club format and you're interested in hearing more book clubs we've done in the past, why not join us over on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get these episodes a week ahead of time, as well as access to some cool other items. We're sort of in the process of updating some of those tiers. But if you're interested in going to our $10 premium level, you can get access to all of our previous year's book clubs. We have 3 other book clubs that we've done. You also get to hear even more of Alan, as well as the rest of our crew here. So that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Special thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Urban from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with part 2 of How to Win Friends and Influence People in 3 and 4. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.